Hey guys, I'm Kevin Secours, and today we are going to be talking about 5 essential tips for improving head and arm chokes while standing, and we're going to have a second part on 5 essential tips for improving head and arm chokes on the ground. But before we get into the dynamics of head and arm chokes, I want to talk about chokes in general. There are 2 fundamental ways we can choke. We can either seal the air passage, sealing the trachea, or seal blood flow by sealing the arteries. Now, a lot of times people will teach, especially in the older traditional arts, sealing the windpipe. I'm going to borrow Giordano here. If you look at traditional chokes like Hadaki Jimi, where we go straight across the trachea like this, it's a very simple choke to apply. The danger with it is it's not entirely reliable. There's a huge component of fear and pain compliance, which if Giordano's in a hugely escalated resistant state or on drugs or anything like that, this may not necessarily give you the pain compliance you're looking for. Secondly, kinking that air pipe always carries with it high risks, namely sort of bending and literally kinking it like a tube or cracking the trachea, in which case we have a lot of blood going into the lungs and a high probability of death. So it's not really a great, reliable choke for people in positions of responsibility like law enforcement or security. When we get into vascular restraint, we need to have both arteries closed on either side. So the most common way taught is to have a bicep on one side with the forearm on the other, and what we're looking for is alignment of the chin and my elbow with my arm firmly placed underneath. But one of the difficulties with this is that in a lot of the sort of naked chokes that we'll see like this, rear nakeds, we see the second arm being figure four up to the top. There's a variety of ways it's done. But what I want to put out there, just for food for thought, and I know this is going to be controversial, is that there are a lot of grappling arts out there, and they're being taught with a variety of experience levels and a variety of understandings. Oftentimes they're purely based on competition, and so the goal is to get a tap out or a submission at any cost. But if we look at it from a responsible power perspective, where we're talking about using it to cause the least amount of risk and injury to the subject for their own benefit, we have to really seriously consider the danger of putting pressure on the trachea. A lot of chokes like the guillotine are commonly taught with pressure expressly being placed on the trachea, and that does carry a risk. Moreover, the neck itself is a fragile structure, to say nothing of all the danger and the risk for spinal injuries and the vulnerability of the vertebrae there. So we want to approach this with a lot of caution if we are in a position of responsible power. And what I want to say is that if our goal is to kink off those 2 arteries to cause the fastest possible stoppage of blood flow to the head, then we have to ask ourselves, what advantage is there in applying force in other directions? You will see high-level masters prescribing the application of a blood choke with the addition of a kinking of the neck in order to also seal off the trachea. You will see high-level masters talking about using the support hand in order to push the head forward or to the side for this express purpose. But in reality, if we're doing a rear naked choke and our goal is only to apply arterial pressure, then oftentimes simple pressure on the wrist as a support is going to be enough. And if I do add the second hand, although it's not the goal or the objective of this download, what I want to talk about is that if I put my second hand up here, I should be seeking to get as tight as possible, and I should be looking to squeeze my elbows together rather than applying any force forward. Any force forward towards the trachea is augmenting force on the trachea, and that is increasing the risk to the subject. So one of the things to look at when we apply head and arm chokes, if we're in a symmetrical position or we're sort of in a mirrored position where our heads are both in the same alignment, it's very difficult to apply direct force on the trachea. What we're essentially going to be doing is using our single arm as pressure on one artery and the subject's own shoulder as pressure on the second. And the trachea remains relatively protected there. The only exceptions are going to be when we have them in a north-south configuration, where in this case, the armpit of the subject is still providing some degree of incidental protection for his trachea. I could naturally crank up my shoulder and my elbow and add slightly more, so there is still a risk. But what I want to submit to you is that the head and arm choke is actually, in many cases, a safer alternative from a tracheal perspective. So oftentimes people consider the rear naked choke to be a superior choke, but from my experience in security and working as a bouncer, as a doorman, the head and arm choke comes out very, very often. It's very reliable if we understand how to apply it, and we want to know how to apply it from standing and from the ground. In all of the applications today, my goal is always going to be safety first, so we're looking to minimize force on the trachea. And I recognize that there are a lot of other styles out there that are going to encourage you to wrench that elbow and put a lot of direct pressure on the trachea to cause fear and cause that respiratory impingement. But I submit for you that it's very unsafe, and if your ultimate goal is responsible power, or even in a self-defense setting, if you're looking to avoid legal consequence down the line, which is always a consideration for anyone in our modern society, please consider minimizing the strain and the pressure on your partner's trachea. High levels of danger, high levels of risk. Okay guys, tip number one for acquiring the head and arm choke is you just want to make sure that when you get into that position, we're going to have the subject's single arm up on our shoulder, nice and deep, his head, and then my arm going through and wrapping around the back. You will see lots of variations that look really cool where people will make different hand configurations, oftentimes using the notch of their thumb into the brachial junction in the side of the neck, or getting into the carotid sinus, or things with the fingers and the thumbs. And they can all be painful, but in my experience, against a highly resistant person, when I start fidgeting with my hand, I leave too much space with my elbow. I don't have as much control and affectation over their spine, and I don't have a good carotid choke. So I'm sacrificing control and choke time in order for some hope for pain compliance. And the reality is I don't want to roll those dice. I don't want to make that gamble. So what I want to do, tip number one, is I want to go in as deeply as possible with my bicep. Again, it can be a little bit height dependent if you're a bit shorter. At first that might be your wrist and you might be vicing the person down to get to that depth, but get to the deepest depth possible as quickly as possible. Don't be complex, don't try to be cruel, just latch it on, hold it, and choke. So number one, avoid the complexity and the temptation to do cool stuff. Get it nice and simple, drill it nice and simple over and over and over, and have a really reliable go-to. Okay guys, tip number two for the head and arm. In every case, we should train multiple ways to acquire it. We should be able to get it from a standard lockup. We should be able to get it from duck unders where we go under the armpit. We should be able to get it from somebody who does a bridge arm against us by neutralizing the arm and rip it off. We should be able to get it from underhooks and pikes, from arm drags, you name it. But no matter how you get it, no matter how you get to your go-to, in every single case, there is a high tendency to freeze frame on the choke. And when we freeze frame and stay static, the subject is more able to start formulating escapes by retracting or windmilling out their arm. They're more able to start counter hitting, and they're more able to start doing things like counter throws and takedowns. So you want to keep them on their heels, and you want to keep yourself on the balls of your feet. So train yourself first from a comfortable position, acquiring the head and arm, and then immediately driving them back towards their triangle point, back towards their heels. Then slowly work from more familiar positions, acquiring it, and have no gap between acquisition and rear drive, and then incrementally add resistance until you're able to do it with full force, getting underneath and driving them right away to the back position. If they're on their heels, they will have much less ability to counter you, and you'll have much greater success in the acquisition. Alright guys, number three tip for functionalizing head and arm when standing is to learn 2 or 3 really easy strikes that you can deliver while maintaining the lock and while driving forward. So the obvious one is to do walking knees, where I perform knees that drive in from my low line, usually into the thigh, sometimes into the groin, while I push the subject backwards. They should be coming out as a mid-punctuation of my step. If I want to deliver a huge shot, I don't want to stop and go for a big shot into the leg or the groin. So normally what I'll do is, as I'm running forward, is I'll change levels in squat and then launch out of the squat with the knee. So moving forward, change levels, launch, and then continue with the walk. If I'm going to use my arms, I try to avoid using the choking arm. Sometimes people will use the primary choking arm to hit the back of the neck, but in doing that, we start to lose a lot of mechanical advantage, and the subject will have a lot of power with their neck to begin pushing their own arm away from me, or away from their own neck rather, and deform my own spine. And that'll cause me to lose the hold, allow them to retract, get out, and then you're into a face-to-face clinch. So rather than that, I can just focus on keeping my thumb down on my choking arm with good radial muscle and bicep engagement, and use my second arm to hit, or I can use that choking arm to turn and to cup the meat of his lateral muscle or his armpit. In either case, however I choose to hold, my second hand is either going to do palm strikes or short hooks into the base of the shoulder blade, into the kidney area, either drilling downwards to the hips or spiraling up to the mouth. Both of those are nice, simple, easy, and natural shots. Of course, there's also stomping on the feet every once in a while, or oblique kicks to the foot. But what matter are that those strikes are natural, and they can come out of forward pressure that keeps the subject on the heels. It'll always beget the question, what's to stop the subject from hitting you back? What's to stop it from turning into World War knee, where you're just knee fighting back and forth? It's keeping him on their heels. If I'm on my toes driving forward and they're on their heels falling backwards, they're going to be ineffective, if not completely unable to deliver their own strikes. Number 4 essential tip for functionalizing the head and arm choke while standing is always have the capacity to at least neutralize them up against the wall when objects are permitting, or to take them to the ground. So you want to have one or two simple go-to takedowns that work. The simplest ones, of course, are variations of body locks where you use the knee to buckle the knee flexion and to simply kneel down and sit them. We'd always prefer to have the subject sit on the tailbone, sit on the buttocks, and then roll them to a laying position. Of course, if you need things a little bit more vigorous, you can go into things like body drops, sacrifice throws, and pistol throws, but these carry with them a certain risk. One, because the head is going through a more traumatic arc. Two, because you're often required to release your hand in going down to brace yourself for the impact. That can cause you to lose the lock or to hurt your own arm. And of course, there are also variations where you can use like a wave shrug to lift them off the ground, which temporarily puts their nape and their cervical arch into a state of traction. It can cause impingement or neck damage, so it's a little bit more dangerous. But if it was a much more escalated scenario, you were trying for a restraint, the subject was becoming very, very aggressive. I don't want to release it to go for hits because it's just that too dire and too serious. I could shrug them up and sit them down, being very careful not to plunge drop or to sprawl on them, as that can even more seriously damage the neck. Alright guys, the number 5 tip for functionalizing the standing head and arm choke is to always have the capacity trained to abandon that lock. Train the capacity to abandon that lock. That means you've got to practice not getting it and how to safely free yourself from it. One of the problems with any sort of restraint tactic or submission lock is that oftentimes it requires a huge investment on our part. If it's not working, there's very often a natural reflex to chase it and chase it and chase it, but there's diminishing returns. So if it's not working, yes, I want to be able to take him down, yes, I want to be able to hit, but if it's really not working, I need to know how to abandon it and get a safe distance, and I need to ingrain that reflex in my scenario training so I don't chase something that's not working for me. Alright guys, there you have it. 5 simple tips for improving and maximizing your head and arm choke while standing. Number 1, keep it super simple. Don't try to be clever. Number 2, you always want to drive through and keep them on their heels. They can't fight well if they're on their heels. You want to be on the balls of your feet driving, and you want them on their heels. Number 3, have 2 or 3 go-to strikes that you can deliver while driving them forward. If that doesn't work, number 4, pin them up against the wall or take them down with something high probability and easy. And number 5, always train in your scenario training to know how to abandon it safely so that you don't become a slave to the move and chase it into a point of diminishing returns. As always guys, I hope you like the work. If you have any questions, feel free to drop me a line anytime. Hope to see you on the mat.